choices. Imagine you can't make your own decision. That wouldn't be a world for me. That wouldn't be a world for you. UIC. Tell them we're gonna be stronger. Together we can make it right. Our purpose is a better Jamaica for you and I. Gonna be stronger together. Time we all just unify. Our purpose is a better Jamaica for you and I. It is a natural right for every human being to be free. Free, so free. So the government is there to protect you and me. UIC objective is to liberate the citizens from colonial bondage, them regulation, them taxation. Rob Jamaica, we independent. Be stronger together we can make it right. Our purpose is a better Jamaica for you and I. We're gonna be stronger together. Come we all just
Hello and welcome to our series on Why Vote Jamaica. My name is Joseph L Patterson. I'm the founder and president of this UIC movement. Now, please remember to like, share, comment, and get everyone you know to subscribe to help us overcome the media blockout of the movement. Tonight, we look at reason number one of why many are choosing to join, donate, and vote UIC. I hope that after this session, you'll also decide to join us in the fight for your rights. In each of the next sessions, we'll look at the other reasons why we should all vote UIC. So, why vote UIC Jamaica? Reason number one, to replace the monarchy and its colonial system of governance with a true republic, to protect your sovereignty, including the right to choose what goes into your body without being victimized by your employer or your government. You might recall what happened during the pandemic, how efforts were made to pressure people into violating their own bodily autonomy. So tonight our focus is on why we need to make sure we get rid of the monarchy and the colonial system and replace that with a true blue republic. Okay? And so I'm looking forward to our engagement tonight as we go through this particular session. So welcome to all of you. Happy to see you on. I'm seeing a number of old friends. Let me see here. Donovan Davis, Lion Rule the Jungle, Sonia Mignat, among others. Can't read out all the names now, but I'm going to get right into it because we have a lot to cover tonight, a whole lot to cover in a very short period. So the history of the monarchy is enough for us to completely sever ties with that institution. We should have done that from day one. The moment we got the chance to be independent, we should have severed complete ties with the monarchy and chart our own truly independent future. But sorry to say, our early leaders were imposters. Yes, I use the word imposters. And when you see what I have to present to you tonight, I'm sure you're going to agree with me, at least those of you who want to be honest. Remember last night we talked about honesty? Well, tonight we're going to talk about why we absolutely, unequivocally must remove the monarchy, remove every ounce of that system that they have given us through our leaders to be the basis for how we would live our life as a nation. And so tonight, to kick this off, I want you to look at a video on why, if you carefully consider all the points in this video, why we definitely must get rid of the monarchy, and not just the monarchy, but the political system that they gave us. And by extension, I think we need to make sure we fully fire the two political parties that have carried out their system as well. So let's take a look now on the first video that we need to study carefully in our quest to understand why we absolutely need to get rid of the monarchy. Let me see if I can do this for you.
Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history.
You might have heard, the Queen is dead and the world is in mourning.
Really quite surprised at how emotional I felt, actually.
Sort of like a numb, empty feeling.
Take down the bunting from the Jubilee, paint it black and, respectfully, hang it up again. But respect doesn't have to mean reverence, even if she was a bit like the nation's now. Many people find it hard to overlook the fact that the global significance and power of the British monarchy stems from the enslavement and exploitation of people of colour. As the world remembers the most iconic moments from the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, it's important to give equal attention to the human costs that made it possible.
Royal Empires of Dirt, a show about how British monarchs got rich at the expense of everyone else.
If you look past the corgis, the coins, and the ceramic commemorative tap, you'll find that the royal family is a bona fide financial empire. Working out its exact value isn't easy because, like any half-decent financial empire, it goes to great lengths to obscure it. In early 2021, an investigation found that the Queen successfully lobbied Parliament to keep her private wealth hidden from the public. But last year, Forbes estimated that the headline value of the royal family's holdings was worth more than $28 billion. That includes Buckingham Palace, the Crown Jewels, huge areas of land across the UK, and some prime London real estate. The late Queen and Prince Charles did pay some voluntarily, but the British monarch is exempt from paying most taxes, including inheritance tax. That means Charles inherits a $737 million private estate without paying the 40% tax rate that the rest of us commoners do.
The crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland come to the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George.
I am deeply aware of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities which have now passed to me.
Now that Charles is king, £1 billion worth of property that belonged to him outright will also now pass to Prince William. It's fair to say that the Windsors will not be weighing up whether to heat or eat this winter. But where did these riches come from in the first place?
For it is the empire, which includes 1/4 of all the land and of all the peoples of the world, that gives to Britain its position as a first-class power.
From the 16th century onwards, the British monarchy was central to the establishment, expansion, and maintenance of the British Empire, the largest the world has ever seen. One of the ways they amassed wealth and power was through the transatlantic slave trade, of which the royals were largely in favor. The 1562 journey of John Hawkins, the first English person known to have included enslaved Africans in his cargo, was approved by Queen Elizabeth I herself. After Britain invaded Jamaica in 1655, the Royal African Company was set up by royal charter under King Charles II. Its purpose was to control the West African slave trade and protect the British monopoly against the Dutch. The RAC went on to transport more enslaved Africans to the Americas than any other single institution ever, lining the pockets of the Stuart monarchs. Many of those trafficked were branded with the initials DY, as in the Duke of York, who led the company and later became King James II. Britain's shameful history of slavery is inextricable from the royals who were so eager to profit from it, and that barbaric legacy extends today. Historic royal residences like Kensington Palace and Hampton Court Palace that date back to the 17th century were, to some extent, funded by slavery. So while it's hard to tell just how much of the Windsor's wealth derives from slavery today, it quite literally helped to build the roofs over their heads. And these days, it's the British taxpayers who are footing the maintenance bill. In 2014, they paid $7.6 million to refurbish a 20-room apartment for Will and Kate in Kensington Palace. During Queen Victoria's reign, the Slavery Compensation Act meant a £20 million payout. £17 billion in today's money was paid out to slave owners, not the people who had been enslaved or the countries they were taken from.
It represented at the time 40% of the Treasury's annual spending budget. The sum was so large that it took British taxpayers 182 years to pay off.
In recent years, more and more former colonies are saying they want out of the Commonwealth and an apology. And while they're at it, their rightful share of those billions, maybe even trillions, is complex to calculate, but some estimated figures for reparations suggest that the UK owes a staggering amount of money, around $10 trillion to the Caribbean and to Africa each, and $44.6 trillion to India. It's enough to make you sweat, unless, of course, you're Prince Andrew.
Ahead of the couple touching down here, there have been protests which have cast a distinct shadow over this visit.
Earlier this year, Will and Kate were embarrassed on their tour of the Caribbean, and not just because of Will's bad dancing. Before their arrival in Jamaica, over 100 public figures signed an open letter calling on the royal family and the British government to offer an apology and pay reparations. Prince William did express profound sorrow for the appalling atrocities of slavery, but that's not actually an apology or a payout.
Prince William, I hope you feel ashamed in some sense.
They represent a certain kind of history that is unpleasant for our people.
So you can see why so many people around the world view the Queen's death as an opportunity to right historic wrongs. What remains to be seen is whether the new king will be open to reparations, but it's unlikely they'll come at a cost to him and his family. After all, they don't call it the firm for nothing.
Okay, so the slave trade and the compensation for former slave masters was a clear indication who the enemy was. Now, if nobody else should have seen this, our leaders back then in 1944 and in 1962 should have seen very clearly who the enemy was. But based on the actions of our leaders, you couldn't believe that they really understood who the enemy was. Can you imagine no reparations for the former slaves? Not their money that was stolen in terms of their labor, nor the lands that was stolen from their ancestors was returned to them. And the two colonial parties have maintained that system of injustice to this very day. Yes, they have spoken about reparation generally, have given some lovely speeches about the issue, but none of them have seriously taken to task the colonial masters for reparations. But worse than that, it has been within their power to return the land of Jamaica to the people of Jamaica, and they have kept those lands safely tucked away as crown lands and as government lands to be distributed according to their whim and fancy for political gains or for monetary rewards. Now, the monarchies, they also sponsored a new global world order to continue the institution of slavery, but in a more modern form, debt-based money and wage slavery. Remember, I told you, it should be very clear to our leaders from back in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, all the way through to the 90s, to the 2000s. But you would not believe that they understood who the enemy was, because they have allowed Jamaica to continue as if all is well, while the monarchy and those behind it sponsored a new global world order that has continued the institution of slavery, but in a modern form. And that modern form is built around a debt-based monetary system and wage slavery. The colonial powers, when they left us a colonial constitution, which means they didn't really leave us after all. They left us in the care of two colonial parties after effectively killing Marcus Garvey and his grassroots party that was focused on the self-same issues that the UIC is now focused on today. The sole purpose of the two colonial parties was to carry on the imperial traditions in a modern form of master-slave economics. And they have done a brilliant job of it because most of us were fooled by them, thinking that they were working for us. These two colonial parties embraced their colonial constitution. They embraced the monarchy as our head of state. They made us some weak promises that they would make changes, but they used the division that has been instituted by the system as a basis for keeping us in the mental slavery and the economic or wage slavery that has persisted from the 1830s until now. That system has been maintained with small adjustments to appease us, to make us think that they're really working on our behalf. The current leadership of both colonial parties recently welcomed the so-called royals to our shores. No doubt it was an attempt to inspire us to remain loyal to the crown. They know that we have been fooled. For years now, they've been able to fool us. We've been so fooled that when the royals come, the so-called royals, come to Jamaica, our people always welcome them with open arms, always look forward to seeing them, look forward to an invitation to attend one of their functions, look forward to touching them, to touch their white gloves. So they have always been brainwashing us into seeing these people as if they're some kind of gods, and helping us to maintain the idea that some human beings are more sovereign than others, that some human beings are more royal than others. And we fell for it because we were, for all intents and purposes, ignorant. But our leaders, they should have known better, and clearly had all the reasons to know better, but they behaved as if they do not know who the enemy really is. The current Prime Minister even commissioned a lengthy mourning period to elicit our sympathy for the Queen of Slavery. Can you imagine that? Not only did they welcome royals to our shore, the so-called royals, not only did they washing their hands and Hi, can you hear me? Let me know if you can hear me. If you can see me, let me know. Our friends are playing with us again. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Let me know, please. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sir Douglas. All right, so I'm not sure at what point you were disconnected, but I'm going to try to finish what I was saying before I move into the next piece. So basically, thank you very much, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back. So I went and tried to switch over to another carrier to see if we can avoid more disruptions, but we know that they're committed to making sure we can't have these sessions uninterrupted. Change. Okay. It looked like my name is now Charlotte as well. So let me try to change my name here. Amazing. Amazing, folks. Amazing. All right, let's try this again. So I was pointing out, I'm not sure how much you heard, so I'm going to kind of recap. The point I wanted to make was that based on the history of the monarchy, it should be very clear that they can't be trusted. They should not be trusted. We should not want to have anything to do with them. But the leaders that we have had from the 1930s all the way through to today have consistently found a reason to keep us attached. And they have found a reason to maintain the system of governance they prescribed. And they have caused our people for years to be ignorant of what has been done to them, to be unaware of who the enemy is, and to become complacent and comfortable in the continuation of a master-slave economic model that consistently undermines their well-being as a people. And so, thank you very much, Mr. Neil. They have left us a constitution. They have left us a constitution. They have given us a constitution. They have enforced upon us a constitution through the two major parties that at the end of the day has created a number of issues. First of all, the colonial constitution that they gave us was accompanied by two colonial parties. The same two parties they used to effectively kill Marcus Garvey and his grassroots party, which was truly an indigenous party that was designed and built to pursue the interest of we the people. The sole purpose of the two colonial parties was to carry on the imperial traditions in a modern master-slave economic model. These two colonial parties clearly embraced the colonial constitution. They embraced the monarchy as our head of state. And even though they made promises that they wanted to make changes, they used their division and play each other off the other to suggest that, well, we can't really get it done because the other side isn't cooperating, and so on. And this was their basis of keeping us in mental slavery and economic slavery or wage slavery. The current leadership of both parties recently welcomed royals to our country, and no doubt they use that as an attempt to see if they can keep us, connected and glued to this colonial system all the way through. And so the current PM, you even saw where he commissioned the lengthy mourning period to elicit our sympathy for the Queen of Slavery. And on top of that, if you look at the general behavior of even the current Prime Minister and this government, they're meek and mild, nice and soft and sweet with the monarchy, but they're harsh and brutish and rude towards the people of Jamaica. They not only tried to force the foreign master's injection upon us, but they also bulldozed our homes, called us squatters, mashed up our stalls, and assaulted those of us who peacefully protested their attack on our individual rights and freedoms. At the same time, you see them gladly accepting Queen Counsel title and happily proclaiming God save the Queen and God save the King. So they have a subtle, hidden, tricky disdain for the people of Jamaica and almost godlike reverence for those who are in fact our enemies. Now, this colonial system also got us to be engaged in a fraudulent or fiat monetary system. And this is very important now, folks. They were able to con us. Well, I don't even know if it's a con, because our leaders went into it happily. So we, the people, were conned, but I don't believe our leaders were conned. They loved what was being offered to them and they embraced it. I refuse to do that. I prefer to think about what we're being offered. And so the colonial fraudulent fiat monetary system was foisted upon us as a people. It included borrowing money at interest from the IMF and large private banks at interest. This system of fiat money or fake money was designed to keep us indebted, poor, and dependent on these colonial powers who were the ones giving the loans. And by the way, these loans were fake loans. They weren't giving us money that they earned. They were just printing money into existence and giving it to us, and we had to pay it back with interest. When we should have been organizing our economy and printing our own money and not borrowing money from any private bank, local or international. And I know that that's something heavy for some of us because we haven't had the chance to truly understand how money and banking really works. But trust me, I've studied it carefully. We should never have adopted that system of fraudulent money, but our leaders did. They blindly chose expediency over good governance, lazy or just too worshipping of our colonial masters. They loved them so much, they appreciated them so much that they could not take the time to think. Yes, BCA, the Bretton Woods system, a part of it. So our leaders decided that they were going to simply adopt a system that if any one of them had the slightest degree of financial sense, they should have been able to see that the model they're about to adopt is one that was going to crush our people, which it did. Now, I want you to watch a video that's going to show you what that has done to our people. And then we're going to talk some more about it in terms of how we need to interpret that today. So I want you to see this video. I want you to understand what adopting this monetary system, this fake fiat monetary system did to our country, did to our people, even to this very day, because we're still under it. So I want you to see and understand that system.
First of all, you go to the private banking system and you see, well, can I get a private banking loan? Because I'm strapped for cash, I need some support, and I'm having trouble paying my overseas bills.
When the private banks won't lend to you, then you've got to do something if you're the leader of the country. And typically what you've got to do is to cut back your spending in some way and try and get more money so that the impact of those cutbacks are not as severe as they otherwise would be. And it's at that point that you generally come to the IMF.
What you really need is to sit down with them and say, look, can I work out a 5-year program? And in the meantime, I'm strapped for some cash, so can you help me up front get out of the cash bind and then put it in the context of a long-term development plan? And they said, no, long-term development is your problem. We are here only to see who do you owe the money to, why are you in a bind, and we'll lend you some money in a very short time frame at full interest rate to get you out of the bind. And they then impose upon you tremendous restrictions in what you can spend.
And then we reach agreement on a set of measures on the budget, on the exchange rate, on monetary policy, on interest rates, on banks, on maybe privatization, and say, yep, we think this could solve your problem.
And you say to them, but if I do it that way, when I finish repaying you, I'm going to be in the bind all over, because this can't solve my problem. They say, not our problem.
The whole idea was to set conditions which the government could not meet. And when the government failed to meet them, you would have to renegotiate a new loan in which the conditions became tighter. So the IMF didn't say, cut out this education program or cut out this health program. What the IMF said is, you must spend only so much money on health and education. And the implication of that was that you had to cut out some programs.
Essentially, what the IMF wanted us to do was to devalue our currency. That's the first thing, to make our dollar cheaper.
They needed to expand their exports and diminish their imports. And the best way of doing that is to make foreign currency more expensive.
And since our society is so heavily dependent on imported food, imported fuel, imported books to go to school, imported medicine, when we devalue, the cost of those things we import go up to the citizens. And as a result, the economy today is much more under the control of foreigners, not necessarily through direct ownership, but through the mechanism of debt. In the 1970s, we owed $800 million. By the end of the 1980s, we owed $4 billion. Nowadays, we owe $7 billion. So the debt is rising, and all the time the debt is rising, our capacity to export, to produce, is getting less.
All right, so that should give you a very clear indication as to how the monetary system that we bought into affected us. Now, you heard Mr. Manley explaining the bind that he was in, and he's blaming the IMF for the bind that he was in and which Jamaica was in. But as you're going to see later on as I go some more, Mr. Manley should not be blaming the IMF, and we should not blame the IMF. We are the ones who decided to be a part of that monetary system. Our leaders decided to be a part of that monetary system. They never had to do that. And if they chose to be a part of it, they could have managed their side of the equation very differently. But they did not manage their side of the equation properly. We never had to go to a fiat monetary system. We never had to borrow at interest for consumption. We never had to destroy our industries for unsustainable loans. But instead of doing what we should have done in terms of managing our internal affairs, we opted for the easy way out, jump on everything our former colonial masters proposed. And when we jump into it and the trap catch we, then we'll complain and point fingers back at them. No, it's our choice. We chose, our leaders chose to take us down that path. Just like how today, they're making choices. And I'm hoping that you are going to see the choices they're making and decide that you are going to make a different choice now for yourself. I hope you understand where I'm going with this. So the next thing that happened, remember first I told you that we have a history to look at of the monarchy. And if you look at the history, you see clearly why we should have understood who the enemy was and should have severed ties with them as quickly as possible. and move into a different model of governance as quickly as possible. I explained to you how the monetary system that was in place, they did not have to follow that monetary system, but they chose to. That monetary system has bitten us over and over. And even now, recently, you saw the Prime Minister again going back for more. You saw in the 1990s how PJ Patterson told us that for political expediency how they're leaving the IMF, but really all they did was to leave the strictures of the IMF funding to the private banks and run up our debt even further, run with it, and then leave us to pay the price. You should have seen that clearly. Then the colonial partisan political system now, how tenaciously we have held on to it, how we have preserved it and mastered it and use it as a tool to keep our local elites wealthy while tricking us into fighting each other, thinking that whichever party we join, somehow one is better than the next, when the reality is further from the truth. The colonial partisan political system is used to divide, to distract, and deceive, so that a few of us, working in collusion with the colonial powers, working in collusion with the big money elites in Jamaica, which I call the PSOJ oligarchy, a few of us, just a handful of us, about 7,000 people in this country, roughly, a handful, 7,000 out of 3 million. And that handful of people work systematically to divide us into green and orange, to distract us with partisan gimmickry, to distract us with all kind of flimsy policies and suggestions, feel good and sound good policies at election time, about free water or a portion of electricity bill being paid, all foolishness. And deceiving us with even beautifully sounding solutions such as NHT. Meanwhile, every single day, every single week, every single month, every single year, they are siphoning off billions of dollars into their reserves, making their pockets fatter, building up their beautiful homes, driving in their secured vehicles, and living behind secured walls, while you are running up and down about you're fighting for PNP or fighting for GLP. This system of divide and conquer has been used forever. And it's a perfect part of the weaponry of our colonial masters. And anybody who seeks to preserve that system is somebody who is in love with the colonial powers. This system should never have been adopted. And if we had followed Marcus Garvey, it would not have been adopted. But instead, we allowed them to kill Marcus Garvey because them come with handouts to give we. Because they had the backings of the plantocracy, which is now the PSOJ, so they could give them the money to come and make us licky and give us the t-shirts and give us the caps and give us the little money and give us the goats and give us the rum, and with us join in and follow along, not realizing that we are destroying ourselves. This system should never have been adopted and needs to be destroyed right now. We must get rid of partisan politics, or we shall forever remain divided and forever remain conquered and forever enrich a few at the expense of the many. In this video, I am going to show you clearly how that works, or at least the impact of it on the people of Jamaica over all these years, right down to today. I want you to watch, and I want you to see, and I want you to understand how this thing is affecting our beloved country and how it is destroying us as a people.
The year is 2010. An American military spy plane circles in the air as soldiers fire mortar shells into densely populated civilian areas while taking fire from heavily armed militias. Over 3 days, over 70 civilians are killed. But this is not a war zone in Afghanistan or Somalia. This is a drugs bust in Kingston, Jamaica.
Police in Jamaica are calling for nationwide tranquility, urging people to remain calm following the arrest of a reputed drug baron and gang leader.
A few miles away, tourists are sipping rum and smoking weed in resort hotels. And to be fair, this is no ordinary drugs bust. This is the massive military operation it took to bring down Dudos Coke, also known as the President.
His real name is Christopher Michael Koch. Now the man considered to be one of the world's most dangerous drug kingpins has been captured and brought to justice.
This is how a narco warlord mixed drugs, violence, and political connections to wield power throughout Jamaican society. This is the story of Dudos Coke, aka the secret president of Jamaica. Dudos Coke's rise to power is rooted in the brutal gang violence that has scarred Jamaica for half a century, and how this violence has been manipulated and encouraged by the country's political elite. When Jamaica gained independence from Britain in 1962, the country quickly came to be dominated by two political parties, the left-leaning PNP and the more pro-American Jamaican Labour Party. In particular, two leaders, Michael Manley of the PNP and Edward Seaga of Labour, divided power between them, swapping stints as Prime Minister for decades.
On the Michael Manley campaign trail, it's a day of spot meetings deep in the agricultural heartland of rural Jamaica. He caps his message with a cry, "Forward with socialism," but later denies that he aims to establish a second communist Cuba in the Caribbean.
These two men emerged as the first political leaders in independent Jamaica. They had a kind of messianic aura about them. People looked to them for new paths for the independent Jamaican society.
And this political rivalry played out on the streets. Each party made alliances with gangster bosses known as Dons who ran certain neighborhoods. The semi-official deal was that the Don would deliver the votes of the people in their area, and in return, they could run organized crime syndicates with protection from the police.
The Jamaican Don really evolved first as a political enforcer. If you happen to be residing in a PNP community or a JLP community, then the enforcer's job is to enforce that political loyalty sticks, whether you like it or not.
These alliances between politicians and gangsters would erupt into open gang warfare, particularly in the run-up to elections, as each party tried to intimidate the other's supporters.
One of the most important aspects of the election has been the violence that's marked the campaign. And whilst politicians have argued, gunmen have been shooting it out in the streets.
As the murder rate spiraled out of control, rumors circulated that weapons were being supplied by the CIA and Cuban paramilitaries. Neighborhoods became known as garrisons, literal fortresses which police couldn't enter, with gang bosses wielding almost complete control. And just as the violence was getting so bad that not even Bob Marley could fix it, something happened to make it even worse: the war on drugs.
This is crack cocaine, seized a few days ago by drug enforcement agents in a park just across the street from the White House. Let there be no mistake, this stuff is poison.
In the 1980s, cocaine and crack cocaine exploded in popularity across America. Jamaica sits exactly halfway between Colombia and southern Florida and became a key trafficking hub. This fundamentally changed the balance of power between the politicians and the Dons. Instead of the gangsters waiting for handouts and building contracts from the government, they now found themselves at the center of a multi-billion-dollar trade.
By 1980, there is this influx of cocaine coming through the Caribbean corridor into the United States. And these political enforcers, they are now making a lot of cash from trafficking marijuana and trafficking cocaine.
The most important garrison community in Jamaica at the time was the West Kingston ghetto of Tivoli Gardens. As the cocaine trade began to boom, Tivoli was controlled by a gang known as the Shower Posse, strongly allied to the Jamaican Labour Party.
The Shower Posse got its name because of its brutality. The Uzi and the Tech 9, those were guns that the Shower Posse really loved. They would take out their opponents by showering bullets.
Jamaican gangs like the Shower Posse and their rivals, the Spangler Posse, spread out across the US and the UK. Unlike the Colombian and Mexican trafficking groups, who concentrated on the wholesale side of the cocaine business, the Jamaican gangs also began taking control of street corner dealing in American cities, and this brought them into bloody conflict with local American dealers. The Jamaican gangs were used to fighting full-scale street battles with automatic weapons and brought a whole new level of violence to the American gang wars. The US was already experiencing a spike in homicides throughout the 1980s, but the arrival of the Shower Posse and other Jamaican groups is thought to have accelerated this, with estimates of them being responsible for over 1,400 homicides by the late 80s. This was when Dudus took control of the Shower Posse and massively expanded its drug trafficking operations. It's also when people started calling him the President. Dudus dramatically reorganized the Shower Posse's operations in the US, adopting a franchise model where individual cells were free to run themselves across America as long as they sent money and guns back to Jamaica. But back in Tivoli Gardens, his authority was absolute.
He is the supreme kind of leader of Tivoli Gardens, this almost state within the Jamaican state.
The entrances to the garrison were blocked by barricades, so police couldn't enter. The Shower Posse were the law. And this is where the story gets complex, because for a murderous gangster, Dudus can also claim to have helped his community. Dudus ran significant charity and welfare programs in Tivoli, including after-school clubs, help for the elderly, and food handouts. And through legitimate companies, he put on major music festivals featuring Jamaica's biggest stars, as well as receiving over $1 million in government contracts, through which he employed local people.
He provided access to things which the Jamaican state has either been unwilling or incapable of providing. So there was a healthcare facility in that community. There's a sports complex, a very good one, by the way, in that community. He was loved in the community. He was respected, but he was also feared.
Many people in Tivoli appear to have genuine loyalty and even love for Dudus.
The Crips, we have blood, them a bigger terrorist than Dudus. Leave him alone. We not give up with Dudus. We love him bad. And we are going dead for him.
He's name-checked in songs by everyone from reggae legends like Bunny Wailer to UK grime MCs like Skepta. On the other hand, Dudus was unquestionably responsible for murders and extreme violence. In his trial, people testified that his form of justice involved cutting people who crossed him with hatchets and chainsaws. And eventually, Dudus's power brought him to the attention of the DEA. Secret memorandums were drawn up whereby Jamaican police would run wiretaps on the president, but the operation would be run through Washington. The investigation took over 5 years and involved the US giving Jamaican police over $3 million. But eventually, in 2009, the US issued an extradition request.
The then Prime Minister of the day, Bruce Golding, happened to also be Member of Parliament in Western Kingston, which is where Tivoli Gardens is. And Coke is from that area. So the Prime Minister was hesitant with the United States around extradition. What you saw happening was a kind of international relations standoff.
These scandals proved too much for the government, and eventually they sent in the police. But Dudus commanded loyalty across Tivoli and had an army of gunmen to back him up. The police literally couldn't enter the garrison to arrest him, so the army moved in.
My fellow Jamaicans, good evening. This afternoon, the Cabinet, in emergency session, took the decision to advise the Governor General to issue a proclamation declaring a state of public emergency effective 6 p.m. today.
The Americans supplied a military drone, and soldiers even fired artillery into Tivoli housing projects.
A lot of human rights violations happened in that process. Innocent persons certainly got caught up and were killed. Several residents gave horrific stories of what they had to undergo during that incursion.
Them won't let us out. We can't come out and buy food. We're hungry. Can't come out. Still a stitch.
No one ever charged Dudus for murder, racketeering, or political corruption. This was a drug bust, organized by the DEA on trafficking charges. But it was a drug bust in which the army was deployed, over 70 people were killed, and which caused a political scandal across Jamaican society.
To police here, he was a drug dealer, gun smuggler, and leader of a gang called the Shower Posse. Coke was arraigned Friday in a Manhattan federal court. He pleaded not guilty to federal drug and weapons charges.
Dudas eventually wound up in court in New York and was sentenced to 23 years. Not only is the Don system still flourishing, but despite all the people killed and all the millions spent bringing down the president, the drugs are still flowing into the US. In fact, as America has poured resources into its southern border, the Caribbean is now seeing a new uptick in drug smuggling, particularly from the emerging narco state of Venezuela. Jamaica itself voted to decriminalize cannabis in 2015. But as long as the American war on drugs continues, its gangsters will continue to get rich, rule the garrisons, and corrupt the island's politics.
We'd like to congratulate drugs for winning the war on drugs.
Okay, that should be quite informative. I noticed someone is saying that we should not point fingers. Please understand that I'm not pointing fingers. What I'm doing is educating, informing, reminding, and contextualizing. We have to understand what our problem is in order to understand what we need to do about it. So what have we learned from this video and other things that I've said so far? This video actually showed how Michael Manley and Seaga and those before and after them failed to put the interest of the people and Jamaica first. All kinds of other things were placed at the front, including egos, including personal preferences. The JLP under Bustamante got the first 10 years of self-governance. 10 years. Okay? The JLP again got the first 10 years under independence. And in both instances, they failed miserably over that 20-year period, though separated in time. The people did not receive from them the kind of service that they should have received in order for the people to have confidence in that then JLP government. And so the people switched. And they also gave the PNP similarly 2 terms under Norman Manley. And then they gave them 2 terms under Michael Manley. And in fact, they gave the PNP 18.5 years straight from 1989 to 2007 under Manley partially, mostly PJ Patterson, and partially under Portia Simpson Miller. So combine 18.5 years of the PNP plus 2 terms under Manley prior and 2 terms under Norman Manley prior, and still that party failed the people, and the people turned again to the JLP, and they got 1 term under Bruce Golding from 2007 to 2011, and he had to resign in disgrace, a first in the nation's history. The PNP then got 1 term under Portia Simpson Miller and Peter Phillips, who really was the one in charge. But again, they failed the people, and the people fired them in 2016. And that's how we end up now with Andrew Holness, who returned with the JLP. By the way, he was the hand-picked favorite, anointed one by the disgraced Bruce Golding, a corrupt and disgraced prime minister, hand-picking the current person we have as prime minister, who, by the way, was mentored right out of college by Edward Seaga. And he has proven to be worse than both of them combined when it comes to corruption, to a failed economy, and a failed crime plan. There's much for us to learn from this. One of the problems we have in Jamaica is that every election we start almost from zero. We do not maintain a log, a historical trend line in our minds because it's not taught in our schools. In our school curriculum, we do not analyze the politics of our nation. Our students do not sit down and study the politics of our nation from 1944 until the present. They simply study history and social study in a generalistic, paternalistic, deficient way, where they kind of know some dates and names of prime ministers and names of governor generals and years when stuff happened back in slavery. Very, very useless information, not contextualized, not designed in a way to make sure our children, as they grow up, fully understand the history of our country, what has been done to us by our leaders, what mistakes did they make, what good things did they try to do, what policies did they implement, how did those policies impact our economy, impact our education, impact our healthcare, impact our society, impact our culture. None of that. So our people are not going to the polls with a conscientious, well-digested and studied history of how we got to where we are. And so many are making decisions on what them grandmother said, what their mother said, how they feel, and what kind of new antics the parties come with today. And so we get the impression when they bring a new face on the scene that something is about to change. And we should be learning by now that nothing will change. So whether it is the young Michael Manley in him days, or prior to him, his father, Norman Manley, or whether it is the black man time now, well, before it was my leader Barnia, when they compare Michael with Siaga, because one no Barnia, but two somewhat looking white men. Then we have the black man time now with PJ, and we forget the past. And we look on black man time now, we get excited. And then we have woman time now with Portia, we get excited. And then we have young people time now with Andrew, we get excited. And I can bet you, next time you're going to have a Rasta time now, or you're going to have Beauty Queen time now, or you're going to have some other configuration now. But all of this is going to be a simple distraction, a simple continuation of the division, a simple deception, so that a few can continue their extraction. So the purpose of this lesson is to ensure that you get some connectivity in your thinking, so you can understand where this is coming from and where it's going. Because if you don't understand your past, you're bound to repeat it, and repeat it in more miserable forms, because it only gets worse. So clearly, their colonial constitution and their system of partisan politics have not worked. And if given another 78 years, it will only result in more crime, more inflation, and more devaluation. And because of that, we'll continue to have a brain drain of the best leaving, if they can get a ticket, a visa out, and a concentration of less than the best, and corruption of the best that remains, because everybody has to get involved in the corruption scheme to survive in this country. And so as long as we keep the scheme going, the more we're corrupting the culture of the people, the more we're depraving the nation, the more we're becoming lacking morals, lacking scruples, until we don't know ourselves anymore. And then the powers that be just get to come in and finish the cleanup and take back them country. Because I feel them country, and I feel it. We are not behaving like it's our country. We are not deciding to be independent. So we continue to allow ourselves to depreciate until we fall right back in the full control of the colonial masters. I hope I'm being very clear tonight. Yes, they're going to get us right back to Haiti or to Haiti. That's what they've done with Africa. That's what they're doing across the Caribbean. Jamaica is just the next one on the list. Haiti is gone. Haiti is gone bad. Very, very bad. And guess who is second in line? Jamaica. And by the way, these are two top countries. Haiti was the leader of the Caribbean that led the way to show us that we can fight for and secure our freedom. And what did they do with Haiti? They bankrupted the nation. And they bankrupted their leaders mentally and destroyed the country. And they're going to bankrupt Jamaica. They have already bankrupted our leaders, and they're going to destroy Jamaica if we let them. Now, I'm not prepared to let them, but man can't do it alone. And we have to do it. And we have to come together and do it. And so I want to say to you tonight, there was a better way back then. There is a better way today. But first I want to show you that Jamaica was not an anomaly. Jamaica in 1965, in 1962, when they got independence, to be honest, we were in a very, very strong position compared to other colonies, former colonies. We were in a position where we could have taken off tremendously, but we didn't. There was a better way, but that better way required wise leadership, leadership that cares more about the people than personal agendas, ego trips, and the love of money and power. So I'm going to share with you what you expect. Most of you know that I am a student of Lee Kuan Yew. I am a great admirer of Singapore, not because they're special in any way, in terms of anything unique about them personally. But what really caught my attention about Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore was that they were in a worse position than Jamaica at the same time. In 1965, when they got independence, Singapore was in a worse position than Jamaica. And I'm going to show you that tonight. They had every reason to fail. And we had every reason to succeed. This is really significant. Everything was wrong with Singapore when they became independent in 1965. And when we became independent in 1962, while our people were not well educated, we had a homogeneous society, a society where it would have been easier than it would have been for Singapore to get ahead. We had far more resources. As a matter of fact, compared to us, Singapore had no resources except just the people in a very bad state. And we also had our people in a bad state, but nothing compared to Singapore. So the question is, what went wrong? Well, here are two short videos explaining how Singapore got out of their mess, which was worse than ours. And look at it carefully as I showed you. Look at it. I want you to just map it carefully. And you're going to see, step by step, what direction Lee Kuan Yew went, what direction our leaders went. Yeah, you're going to see same problems or even worse on Singapore's side. How did they attack the problem? How did we attack the problem? Now, I can tell you right off the bat, we attacked the problem by not attacking the problem. We created our own problems. So we created new problems instead of attacking the problem. And that's where we went wrong. Now, watch this carefully and see if you agree with me in the end. Let's see if you agree with my assessment of how Singapore, under Lee Kuan Yew, chose to address the problem and how our leaders chose to address it. By the way, the narrator of this video is also somebody from another colonial country, India. So he's looking at it from the India's perspective, which, by the way, is pretty much in line with our perspective as well as a former colony.
Hi everybody! The evolution of Singapore is one of the most fascinating case studies in the modern world history. While our generation knows Singapore as a beautiful, fully developed country, very few of us know that just a few decades ago, in the 1950s, this is what Singapore looked like. The unemployment rate was high, communal riots were erupting from time to time, and the land of Singapore itself was one of the largest slum colonies in the world. And not just that, unlike other countries, Singapore had some severe disadvantages. They neither had a large population to depend on, nor did they have vast lands, and most importantly, they did not have any natural resource like coal or oil. And yet, in spite of these disadvantages, within just 35 years, Singapore went from being a slum city to becoming one of the richest countries in the world. The question is, what exactly happened in those 3 decades that it transformed a small country like Singapore into the economic hub of the world? And most importantly, as the citizens of the largest democracy in the world, what can we learn about the principles of building an incredible nation?
Stop. Just give me 5 seconds and I guarantee you will be shocked. Okay, so I will just...
This is a story that dates back to early 1940s when the World War II was at its peak. Now, just so you know, the World War II was being fought between 2 groups of countries. The first group was the Axis powers and the second was the Allied powers. The Axis alliance consisted of Japan, Germany and Italy. And they were in an agreement such that the Germans would capitalize on continental Europe, the Italians wanted domination over the Mediterranean Sea, and the Japanese wanted domination over East Asia and the Pacific. And in order to tackle this Axis alliance, there was another group of countries called the Allied powers. And this is where we had Great Britain, Soviet Union and the United States. Singapore in 1930 had been a British colony for over 100 years, and the most valuable, or perhaps the only valuable asset they possessed was its location. Because Singapore was at the heart of the trade route that connected Asia and Europe, which is why Singapore became the crown colony of the British Empire. And while the island became extremely prosperous under the British Raj, when the war broke out in 1939, the island was in for a catastrophe. During this time, 2 major events in history happened. On 7th of December 1941, the infamous Act of Pearl Harbor happened, and this is where the military unit of Japan attacked the US naval base, and this was clearly an act of war. And secondly, during the same time, the Japanese troops were sweeping through Asia, and they were very keen on capturing Singapore particularly. But as far as the citizens of Singapore were concerned, they thought since the British Raj was so huge, they would very easily be able to protect the island from the Japanese. But you know what, guys? What followed next was then known as Japan's greatest victory in World War II and Britishers' most infamous act of stupidity, wherein less than 10,000 Japanese troops captured the island of Singapore and took 16,000 British soldiers, 14,000 Australian soldiers and 32,000 Indian soldiers as prisoners of war. And what followed next is regarded as one of the most horrific times in the history of Singapore. The Japanese troops carried out a series of massacres on all the prisoners, including the innocent civilians. Thousands of people were killed in ways that we cannot even imagine, and things were so bad that women were raped and shipped under the tag of military equipments to various parts of the world, and most of these women were aged between 14 to 18. And in the name of eliminating anti-Japanese people, the Japanese army killed around 50,000 people in less than 2 months under something called the Su Ching operation. This was the horrific state of Singapore for the next 3 years until 1945. This is when on 6th of August 1945 another historic event happened, wherein the US military responded to Pearl Harbor by dropping the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And by this time, the German attack had fallen, Hitler was dead, and within a month Italy was about to surrender. So the Japanese had no other option but to retreat from Singapore, and the British Raj came back to Singapore on 12th of September 1945. That is 10 days after the World War ended. But this time, when the Britishers came back, Singapore was no longer the same crown colony that the Britishers lost to Japanese, because the island was completely left in ruins. Much of infrastructure had been destroyed, electricity and water supply lines were broken, many of the telephone services were non-functional, and most importantly, the harbour facilities at the port of Singapore had been completely ravaged. And because of this, the economy of Singapore was in complete ruins, which eventually resulted into massive shortages in food. The condition of Singapore back then was so bad that even rice was considered to be a luxury. And when the people of Singapore witnessed these horrifying conditions, they lost faith in the British government, as a result of which the nationalistic movement began to spark all across Asia. This is where the historic process of decolonization happened, wherein the Britishers began packing their bags because business was no longer viable in Asia. This is the reason why, if you see, after World War II, that is after 1945 onwards, most of the Asian countries began to get their independence from the Britishers. In case of Singapore, instead of leaving the country straight away, they let the elections be held under the British rule itself. And this is where the hero of our story enters. A young 31-year-old lawyer named Lee Kuan Yew, along with 4 other people, founded a party called the People's Action Party, which rose to power in British Singapore. Little did they know back then that this party will go on to redefine the destiny of Singapore to make it an iconic case study for the world to learn from. But back then things were not so good. Singapore had very less resources of their own and they literally had no direction on how to proceed ahead. And this is when they saw a new ray of hope in the form of Malaysia. Malaysia back then was a much bigger country as compared to Singapore. They had many more resources. They still have many more resources. And back then, Singapore badly needed their help. So Malaysia accepted to admit Singapore in its federation, and the People's Action Party, that was in power back then, decided to merge Singapore with Malaysia, making it one of the 14 states of Malaysia. This was done with the vision that Singapore will be able to create more jobs and will have access to the free market in Malaysia, and in return, Malaysia would have access to the Singapore port and the taxes collected from the people of the state. And just when it looked like things were falling in place for Singapore, hell broke loose for Singapore again. Within some time, Malaysia started exploiting Singapore by charging them 39.8% share of taxes, in spite of the Singapore population being just 17% of the population of Malaysia. And on top of that, they started to favor the Malay population and discriminated against the rest, that is, the Indians, the Chinese, and the other minorities. And this soon enough increased the tension between both sides, and what followed next was another series of massacres. On 21st of July 1964, the worst post-war communal riot broke out between the Chinese and the Malays, and this left dozens of people dead and hundreds injured. Eventually, Malaysia declared the state of Singapore to be in a state of danger and finally kicked Singapore out of their country. And that is how, ladies and gentlemen, the island of Singapore obtained its independence not by choice but by compulsive isolation. And this further led to an economic disaster again. Why? Because for more than 100 years, the Singapore economy was intertwined with Malaya. Industrial commodities like rubber and tin were produced in the Malayan mainland, and then they were transported to Singapore to be traded all around the world. But within a fortnight, all of Singapore's warehouses were left empty. Again, people lost jobs, again there were communal violence, and again the economy was in trouble. Now, they had no industries, very few factories, and to make matters worse, their biggest employer, that is the British Army, was planning to leave the country suddenly and completely. And this meant 3 things for Singapore. No protection from the British Army, high unemployment because the Britishers were the highest employers of Singapore, and in addition to the economic crisis, 20% of their existing GDP will vanish after the Britishers leave. This was the pathetic condition of Singapore in 1965. Now the question is, with so many massacres that happened within just one generation, with an economic crisis at hand, with no army, no vast lands, no population, no natural resources, no industries, very less factories, lots of communal violence, with unemployment at its peak and with 20% of its GDP in such a volatile state, how on earth did this little country go on to become one of the richest countries in the world? Hey guys, that was the first episode of the Geopolitics series. I hope you found something valuable in this video. If yes, please make sure to hit the like button in order to let the YouTube algorithm know that you found value in this video.
Okay, so that was part one of the series on how Singapore navigated a very, very bad situation to become a world leader. Remember, 1/15 the size of Jamaica, currently only about 6 million people in Singapore. And by the way, just a bit of a fact for you. If Jamaica did not lose so many of its people by brain drain, today we would have 7 million people approximately living in Jamaica. Let that sink in. Now let's go to the part two, which will complete the thought I want you to have. And remember, look at their situation and compare it to ours, and then look at the choices their leaders made versus the choices our leaders have made for the last 78 years. They made some very good choices in a very short period of time. We are yet to make some very good choices over a very long period of time. Let's have a look now on part two. In this part, we're now going to see more closer parallels between Singapore and Jamaica, because we did not have the kind of wars and stuff that they had. But now they're independent in 1965. We were independent in 1962. Let's now see how that all transpired.
Hi everybody! Today's episode is a very, very special episode because today we are going to talk about one of the greatest leaders in world history. This is the story of a man who turned the small island of Singapore from a slum colony to one of the richest nations in the world. And from the last episode, we know that in 1965, Singapore was already facing an economic crisis, and apart from that, they had no natural resources, no population advantage, no industries, very less factories, and most importantly, their biggest employer, that is the British Army, was planning to leave, which was about to wipe out 20% of their GDP. Basically, every possible obstacle that you can think about to pull the country down to extreme poverty was being faced by Singapore. So the question is, who is this leader? What was his strategy? And more importantly, what can a country like India learn from the incredible case study of Singapore? This incredible person that I'm talking about is Lee Kuan Yew, and his strategy can be summarized in three important pillars that laid down the foundations for Singapore's progress. The first thing he did was to identify the risk points and design a strategic solution for each one of these high-risk elements. And before getting into the act, Lee Kuan Yew spoke to the British authorities and convinced them to stay till 1975, because had the Britishers left immediately, the island would have been left in ruins. Thankfully, the Britishers agreed, and that is how the countdown started for the people of Singapore. And Lee Kuan Yew had just 10 years in hand to turn the situation around for Singapore. Now in 1965, there were three areas wherein they possessed extremely high risk. Number one, the British Army was planning to withdraw, so they needed to build an army from scratch, because during the same time, Indonesia was witnessing a military coup, because of which the government in Indonesia had fallen. And if Singapore didn't have an army of their own, either a country like Indonesia could have invaded them, or there could have been an insider threat. Number two, the Britishers also employed a lot of people, which is why at least 30,000 jobs had to be created before the Britishers left. And last and most importantly, because there were no industries or a lot of factories, they had to build the infrastructure just so that they could either build businesses of their own or invite foreign investment into the island. And this is where the first pillar came in, and that is building an army from scratch. Now, people, to fix this issue of the army, Lee Kuan Yew got in touch with multiple countries like India and Egypt, but nobody actually came to help. That is when, like a guardian angel, Israel came to their support. And just like Israel, national service was made mandatory for all men above the age of 18 by something called the National Service Act in 1967. Now, this gave the island two major benefits. The first was obviously an army of their own, but secondly, each one of these cadets was taught in school that the greatest threat to their country is not an invasion from an outsider, but the conflict within the insiders. And the military practices started to lay the foundations both for the army and the unity of the country. And even today, the value of unity is ingrained in the lessons taught in schools and colleges of Singapore. Then we move on to the second high risk element, and that is creating enough jobs. And this is where Lee Kuan Yew's perspective about learning from other countries came in very, very handy. To tell you about it, people, just like today we've got software companies that are creating jobs all across the world, the era of the 1940s and 50s was all about the textile industry. And this is where countries like Hong Kong and South Korea were also undergoing a similar situation like that of Singapore in the 1960s, wherein they had a poor economy and they did not have enough jobs. So you know what they did? They opened up their country and invited textile companies from all across the world to create jobs because they could provide them with the cheapest labor rates in the world. And Lee Kuan Yew understood the potential of this move way back in 1960s itself. During this time, just like the textile industry was prospering in the 1940s and 50s, the electronics industry was prospering in the 1960s. So way back in 1960s itself, just like Hong Kong, the government of Singapore enacted new laws which would lower the labor costs and gave out amazing incentives to companies by lowering the taxes on imports and export duties. For example, if a company wants to move from one country to the other for manufacturing, the only reason for their hesitance is the heavy investment that they have to make for land and infrastructure. So to make it easy, the government would give them the land at a very heavy discount, and the import taxes on machines and equipment would be lowered to a rock bottom level. If you see, this is very similar to that of the razor blade model, wherein the land and import duties are like the razors which are given away at a dirt cheap cost, just so that the government can create a recurring income out of the taxes on the profits of the company and the salaries of the employees. Now, just to tell you how incredible and futuristic this vision was, here's a fun fact. While Singapore opened up to the world way early in the 1960s itself, China opened up to the world 10 years later, post 1978. And India opened up to the world 2 decades later in 1991, when we were at the brink of an economic crisis.
Hey, what do you do for a living?
I just make money online.
No, but for real.
Oh, I can show you.
And guess what? In case of Singapore, this futuristic move created thousands of jobs for the people of the island. And immediately, just when things were going very well, a shocking news came in, wherein the Britishers announced that they were about to leave the country 4 years early in 1971 itself. And this meant that 30,000 people will be left jobless within that year itself. But guess what? By 1971 itself, Singapore had created so many jobs that not a single one of those people were left jobless, not a single piece of land was left unoccupied, not a single building was left unutilized, and every single resource was turned into an economic asset. This is how Singapore evaded the second risk, and that is loss of jobs due to the early departure of the Britishers. And when this happened, the world knew that Singapore is not just an ordinary island but an extraordinary nation in the making. And this is what brings me to the third pillar, and that is strategic infrastructural investment. People from 1963 to 1975, the government of Singapore took out 14 loans from the World Bank, and 10 of these loans were exclusively invested into the infrastructural projects. And two of the most mind-blowing projects are the Jurong Port and the Jurong Town Corporation, or the JTC. Both these projects were implemented such that Singapore could leverage the only valuable asset they had, and that is the strategic location for trade. And the reason why I say they are mind-blowing is because Singapore invested $14 million to build the Jurong Port, and today the Jurong Port generates a revenue of more than $150 million every single year. Meanwhile, the JTC was responsible for the major infrastructural projects like the cleanup of the Singapore River, which was once a dumping ground, by the way, full of filth, but today it has turned into one of the most beautiful and the most attractive tourist spot in the island. The JTC was also responsible for the reclamation of land and many such major construction projects on the island. And guess what? The same Jurong Town Corporation that was initiated during the old days of Singapore, today it has become a major contributor to the economy, and in 2020 alone, it has generated a revenue of $2.2 billion. This is what happens when the government knows how to do business. Now we move on to the most incredible infrastructural project of Singapore, and that is the fixing of the housing crisis. If you remember, Singapore was once one of the largest slum colonies in the world. And these slum colonies again brought three potential threats to the country. Number one, the slum colonies occupied a large area which could have been used for more productive ventures like industries and hotels. Number two, these slum colonies were in a very unhygienic condition and could have resulted into a disease outbreak within no time. And most importantly, these colonies were formed in clusters and led to communal segregation. For example, there was a cluster wherein only Tamilians lived, or the other cluster where only the Chinese lived. Now, on the outside, this might not look like a big deal, but you know what, guys? Communal segregation is one of the biggest threats to the society, because communal segregation is what leads to communal violence. You don't believe me? Look at any horrific riot that has happened in India or in the rest of the world, and you will see that they are directly or indirectly associated with communal segregation. In case of India, you know very well what type of segregation I'm talking about. This is the reason why Lee Kuan Yew made it a priority to not just build houses, but to also make sure that people of every community lived together without being segregated. And this is where the role of HDB, that is the Housing Development Board, came in. And they executed this using three wonderful strategies. Number one, in order to make houses affordable, they made it mandatory for the people of Singapore below the age of 55 to save 20% of their income into a social savings fund. And this is what was called as the Central Provident Fund. And the employers were also asked to contribute 17% to this fund. And this money could be spent only on specific essentials or on housing. And for those who couldn't afford it, apartments were given at subsidized rates on rent, so that when these people had enough money in their savings account, they could take a low interest loan, eventually buy the house itself. Number two, to prevent these societies from deteriorating into a modern slum, the HDB ensured high quality maintenance and made hygiene a priority, because of which the public housing of Singapore looks like an elite townships. And last and most importantly, the beauty of their town planning is that they introduced something called the Ethnic Integration Policy in 1989. By which every building has a specific quota for every ethnic group depending on their population ratio. For example, the Malays can occupy 25% and Chinese can occupy 87% of the block. And because of this wonderful move, the Chinese, the Malays, the Tamilians and all other minorities lived in the same neighborhood. And most importantly, they had equal access to both the housing facilities like parks and government facilities like metro and railways. And this avoided clusters to a large extent and minimized one of the biggest threats that haunted Singapore for decades, and that is communal violence. And there are very, very less clusters, because of which all the communities in the island live peacefully together. As a result of which, the best part is, politicians have not been able to use communal disputes to create a vote bank. Today, Singapore is such an amazing place to do business that people brag about how you can open up a company in Singapore in less than 3 hours. And the medical facilities are so good that the leaders of other nations take a special trip to Singapore just so that they can get admitted into the hospital and get themselves treated. These are the high standards that Lee Kuan Yew set for the people of Singapore, and in 35 years of his governance, the per capita GDP of the country grew by an astonishing 2,800% and went from just $400 to $14,500. And Singapore went from being a slum colony to becoming a land full of high rises and skyscrapers. And the same Singapore, which was once sinking in poverty, has now become a super prosperous financial and manufacturing hub of the world. And most importantly, Singapore went from being a vulnerable piece of island to becoming one of the richest and one of the most powerful nations in the world. Now we come to the most important part of the video, and that is the lessons from this miraculous case study. Number one, just like Singapore has mandatory military service, we need a system in India not because we want to expand the military, but because today in India, in the name of nationalism, we've got pseudo-liberals and radicals popping up. And in Twitter, you will see more often than not both of these groups engaging in texting wars, which results into nothing but futile debates. But the underlying problem over here is, these cyber riots won't take long before they turn into physical riots. So our generation needs to be taught the value of unity and the fact that there is a thin line between pseudo-liberalism, nationalism and radicalism. Lesson number 2. Every politician, every leader and every citizen in this country needs to understand the difference between mindless socialism, conscious capitalism and evil capitalism. Mindless socialism is when the government gives out unnecessary subsidies, not for the progress of the people, but to create a vote bank. The other extreme of the same is evil capitalism, wherein the government and companies will try to make money even if that means charging for cancer medicines and making money out of the disease caused to the citizens. And far, far away from both these concepts is where we have conscious capitalism, wherein the government puts restrictions on the citizens and spends every penny of the public fund to generate a return on investment and runs a country like an organization which needs to channelize its profits towards the welfare of its citizens. And last and most importantly, people just like world-class companies teach us business lessons and marketing strategies. World-class countries can teach us invaluable growth lessons on how to develop a country. And just like Lee Kuan Yew learned from Hong Kong and South Korea, it is important that the citizens and politicians learn from the success and failures of countries, just so that we can become constructive critics of these policies and politicians can frame policies based on their learnings from these countries. This is the crucial step that we all need to take to become informed citizens of this democracy. And this geopolitics series is my contribution towards making you the informed citizens of this wonderful country. That's all from my side for today, guys. If you learned something valuable, please make sure to hit the like button in order to make it.
I hope you found that session very, very informative, and not just informative, but empowering and stimulating and encouraging, because there are persons who say I talk about Singapore too much and we need to look at other countries. And we have looked at other countries. We have looked at Rwanda, we have looked at Sweden, we have looked at the Netherlands, we have looked at Ghana, we've looked at many other countries. But my purpose is not just to look at countries and share things randomly. My purpose is to make sure I pick the closest one to us in terms of the realities of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and make sure we're doing a comparison with a benchmark that is going to guide our thoughts, guide our analysis to make good decisions. When we compare ourselves, for example, with Ghana, if you look at Ghana, Ghana is, in my opinion, a very big Jamaica. I've been there a few times. It's a lovely country. It has all the beauty that Jamaica has times 100. It also has 1,000 times more resources than we have. But Ghana has the very same political model, the very same colonialistic mindset, and therefore has the very same results like what we have in Jamaica. A very underdeveloped country given the amount of resources. In fact, Ghana is so rich naturally that it should be 1,000 times richer than Singapore, but it isn't. So I am going to focus on finding benchmarks, finding targets, finding KPIs, key performance indicators that I can apply in my thinking, and I can encourage a UIC government to apply and the people of Jamaica to apply, so that we don't get carried away by optics, but focus on pragmatic, practical ways to get us to where we need to be as quickly as possible. But here's what we have learned. Singapore had less resources than us, much more problems than us, and had every reason to fail when compared to us. But they chose pragmatism over careless ideology. They did not pick fights with any superpower, but rather focused on liberating their people economically instead of talking big with nothing to back up the talk. I know many of us are impressed by leaders who talk big, leaders who can go on the world stage and say all manner of things about how the world should be. The first goal, the first responsibility of a leader of any nation is to protect the interest of his or her people, not to get carried away with whatever the latest fad is or the latest international global geopolitics problem is. Your goal as a leader is to make sure you're protecting the interest of your people. And sometimes to do that, you have to shut your mouth. Manly unwisely picked a fight with the nation on which we depended for aids, for loans, and for trade, while scaring off local business owners and skilled professionals instead of quietly doing what Lee Kuan Yew was doing in Singapore. Siaga unwisely followed whatever America told him to do and sank us further into their debt trap while trying to be a don instead of a transformative leader like Lee Kuan Yew. Both Manley and Siaga took sides in the Cold War and allowed themselves and their parties to be used as pawns in a game we had no business playing. And we, the people of Jamaica, paid the ultimate price for their misleadership. So here's the conclusion. The UIC is here to correct the wrongs and to right the ship. The JLP and the PNP have lost the moral authority to lead us any further after 78 years of unbroken failure. It is time for a fresh start. It is time for new leadership. It is time for a new system of governance. No. This must begin with a new vision based on a clear moral direction around which we may all coalesce as a people to achieve good governance, real independence, and real prosperity now. This means the end of the monarchy in totality, not just window dressing. We don't want no fake republic. We don't want you to just come and change the name of the Governor General from Governor General to President and tell us we are a republic like Barbados did. We don't want a fake republic like Guyana did. We don't want a fake republic like Trinidad did. We want a real republic. We deserve a real republic, and the UIC is going to make us the first true republic in the modern history of mankind. We are going to bequeath to the world a true blue republic that fully respects and protects the sovereignty of every citizen and do so equally. Yes, a true republic is one that protects your sovereignty with a truly free and fair market economy, with a safe, clean, and orderly society, where every community looks, smells, and feels like a tourist resort, and where everyone can live, earn, and retire with dignity. That is a true republic, and that is the republic the UIC is going to create. When we're finished, you're going to have one Jamaica, united, strong, and free. We will embrace a new Jamaica, a Jamaica where all Jamaicans everywhere around the world will have full voting rights, overseas, remotely, voting for what they want and who they want. We're going to give every Jamaican, wherever you are, full citizenship rights, even if you have dual citizenship in any other country. We're not going to punish you because you were forced out of your country by bad governance. We're going to embrace you and welcome you and bring you back, even if only to invest or only to retire. But we're going to bring you back into the fold. And by doing so, reverse the 78 years of brain drain caused by two colonial parties because of their reckless and thoughtless and insensitive attitude. We are going to ensure that you can come back to your country 100% duty-free. We're going to roll out the red carpet for every Jamaican who wants to come back to this country. We're going to make sure you receive the treatment that you deserve to facilitate your security and prosperity if you choose to return to your country to live or do business. Wherever you are in the world, you will be treated as a Jamaican, and you will know that we have your back. Yes, my fellow Jamaicans, the time has come for us to finally turn the corner on colonialism, finally turn the corner on bad governance, finally turn the corner on the master-slave economy, finally break through and create one Jamaica, united, strong, and free. And so tonight I have shared with you the first reason why you need to vote UIC. But you don't just want to vote UIC, because voting is not enough. You have to join the movement at uicjamaica.com. You have to volunteer to help the movement at uicjamaica.com. You have to donate to fund the movement at uicjamaica.com, because the PSOJ oligarchy and the colonial powers, they don't want the Jamaica that the UIC is bringing. They want to keep Jamaica the way they have kept it for the last 78 years. But I know you want that Jamaica because you're a true patriot and because you want what's best for you and your family. You want your children, your grandchildren, even if they weren't born in this country, you want them to be able to come home and live here, or at least feel comfortable visiting here or doing business here. And it's not going to happen as long as we continue to maintain the system that these two parties have maintained over the last 78 years. Yes, Sir Douglas, enough is enough. We have outlined for you the history of the monarchy. We have outlined for you the history of Jamaicans operating under a colonial system of governance with two parties that are colonial parties, building an economy which is a master slave economy and denying our people the quality of experience they could have had. And I have shown you how one country who was by far worse than us was able to, in 25 years, transform their country from third world to first world. And we have given these two parties 78 years to not transfer from third to first, but to go from the leading country in the Caribbean to second to last. That, my friend, is untenable. That, my friend, is unacceptable. That, my friends, is worse than a failing grade. We must immediately fire them. We must immediately fire those two parties, not because we're being vindictive or whatever. It's just basic business. You cannot keep an employee who consistently fails you. You cannot keep a management team that consistently fails you. Even after they change leader after leader after leader, it's still the same outcome. So do not allow them to trick you with the next leader them bring come on either side. Don't allow them to trick you with the nice advertisement the PSOJ will pay for. Don't allow them to buy you with the billions of dollars that the PSOJ oligarchy is going to give them at election time to do so. Instead, buy your own freedom. Donate to the UIC, volunteer in the UIC, help the UIC, overcome the media ban that they have placed on the UIC. Help us to get through to your friends, to your family through you, and let us reach the people where they are, and let us extract our people. Enough is enough. The time has come, and the time is now. I have 15 minutes to take questions. If anyone have any questions that they would like to ask before we close the night's program. Any questions or comments? I don't have my usual help tonight, so I can't bring up all of your stuff on screen, but please type it out here. If not, give me and give us a grade of between 0 and 100. If you thought that we did a good job today, please give us 100. Well, an excellent job. If it's so-so, 50%. And if it's not to your liking and not beneficial, 0%. So please go ahead. First question, I think I see a question here. Let me see if I can, okay. Let's see. All right, I hear that there was a caller that came in earlier. Okay, no problem. Let me see here if I can get, how will the UIC manage freedom of speech? Thank you for that question, Devereaux. Freedom of speech, we're going to manage it by allowing every Jamaican the freedom to speak their mind, provided they do so responsibly and can back up what they're saying with evidence, and at least allowing those that are being criticized the same opportunity to respond in kind. Unlike Singapore, we believe in absolute freedom of speech, so long as you're not, violating defamation laws. Any other questions? Any other questions? Let me see here. How will you take us out of debt? Very good question. The debt problem, you see, in Jamaica is primarily driven by the fact that the government borrows at interest for everything. If you notice what Singapore did, when it borrowed, it was for a very specific, highly productive investment. So there are two types of borrowing. You can borrow for consumption, which our government does a lot of, or you can borrow for capital investment. And the capital investment must have a return on that investment. So we're going to shift our model to not borrowing at interest anymore for consumption. And we will only borrow at interest if we have to, and it must be for a highly productive capital investment that is going to have a payoff similar to what you saw in the video with Singapore. It cost them $41 million for this major capital investment, and today they're getting $100 million a year in return on that investment. So that's the kind of things you want to have. Singapore, if you look at their balance sheet, you're going to see where they have a large amount of debt, and that debt is offset by a large amount of asset. So in effect, Singapore has no debt. The debt is just like you being an astute investor, and you use credit, other people's money to invest to get a massive return. So that debt is good debt. Singapore only has good debt. Jamaica, we only have bad debt because all the money we borrow is always wasted or stolen and never results in the productivity improvements necessary. You can measure that by looking at our exchange rate. Our exchange rate is generally always going down, the value always going down. That means we have not figured out how to increase our productivity. In fact, Jamaica's productivity index is normally in the negative. We're normally declining in productivity because of our government. Next, excellent lesson as usual, says Miss McNutt. Thank you very much for that. Janet Graham said, what would you do if you have a treasurer and you're missing money and every treasurer you employ has sticky fingers? Thank you for that question, Janet. No, that's not going to happen. You see, you're not going to rely simply on the treasurer, Janet. What you need to have is a system of internal controls which have multiple checks and balances. So, for example, in business, let's say you have a small business or big business even, or medium size. What you do is you make sure you have multiple points of control. So money is coming into the company, doesn't go into one person's hand. It goes through one cycle where it is checked, but the physical cash doesn't come to that person. Another side where it physically comes in to that side and that person records. And then the bank statement comes in at another side, and then you cross-reference the 3 points and verify the funds. So if you have proper checks and balances in your government, you will never have any serious problems with monies being stolen. But if you have weak checks and balances, like we have in Jamaica, lots of weak checks and balances, then you're going to have misappropriations, very significant. Thanks for everything, Mr. Patterson, says one person. Always teaching us, very good. O'Neill says, would you support constitution amendment for freedom of speech and the press? Absolutely. I mean, what we're going to do, O'Neill, is to ensure that you have absolute freedom of speech and absolute freedom of the press in a responsible way. So you're going to have, the responsible rules. How do you have your freedom to speak in a responsible way? So for example, if you make harsh accusations against anyone, no problem. Just provide the evidence of it. And we will always allow the other side to be able to present their arguments as well. And of course, you're going to make it very easy for these matters to be addressed in court, so that even the weakest among us will have the kind of accessibility to the courts to be able to address any differences very quickly. What else do we have here? Let me see. I'm seeing the success of Singapore is based on you should always encourage people to come out on election day and remind them of the date. Okay, thank you, Master Barbara. We don't know the date yet, so please all come out. But it's much more than that. We will really have to raise some funds. I need 1,000 of you to be giving $25 a month if we're going to be able to do the work. Elections are not won on election day. They're won based on the work you did prior to election day. So if we don't have any money to organize the people, galvanize the people, sensitize the people, educate the people, and communicate with them, and then provide even transportation, on election day you can just sit there and wishing and hoping that people come and vote for you. But that's not how election works. A few persons will come out with the drive, a few, very, very few. Most persons in the Jamaican context, they must be helped to come out to vote. So very important. What else do we have here? Will we have all the Chinese, them own all the business in all the town and city? Well, Christopher Lawrence, the rules are going to be such that the Jamaican people will get the empowerment that they now currently don't have. So you're going to find in the new Jamaica, capital will become readily available now for the small business Jamaican, for the young entrepreneur, for the up-and-coming startup businesses. So you're going to have a very different set of conditions now: access to banking, access to capital, access to training, so that you can quickly bring your ideas to market with the need to do so. So a very, very different Jamaica we're talking about. Do you think the government should invest in energy and technology research and development? Absolutely, Sean Campbell. We have to invest in that, and the UIC will invest in that. The UIC is very committed to making Jamaica energy independent. What are you doing to ensure that they do not sabotage the UIC votes? Very good question, Olga. We have to make sure we have a minimum of 12 persons working in each of the polling divisions as indoor, as outdoor agents. They need to be paid so that their loyalties are properly secured. So a lot of work, but we have to get the donations in. Everybody, the big takeaway from today, if we want to rescue Jamaica, all of us have to become a donor. I've been a donor to the UIC now for the last 10 years, 11 years now, 10 years, 11 years this year. Working hard to build this movement means donating every day. I'm volunteering every day. I'm donating every day. I'm giving it everything I can. But of course, I'm not a billionaire. I'm not among the poorest of persons in Jamaica, but I'm no way near as some wealthy people to be able to fund this on my own, even slightly. So we need you. 100%. Earl and Malcolm says, always learning from you, Mr. Patterson. Wonderful program. Thank you. What will your government do to address the crime problem? Everything that is in our 10-point plan, Rowan, addresses the crime problem. We're going to do a top-down process. We're going to go after the real crime leaders. We're going to create a program for young people to not have to be accessible to the gangs anymore. We're going to have a workfare program that is going to help adults who want to get back into the workforce. We're going to have community policing at a level that makes the police a part of the social work network infrastructure. We're going to change our education model so that it really does what it needs to do. And we're going to change the entire ethos of the country in terms of a new morality, a new moral paradigm. And we're going to give the criminals actually a second chance, the low-level criminals, through an amnesty program, not the kind of fake one the government just did, but a real amnesty program that is built on a truth and reconciliation solution. So we've talked about that in other lives. It's too much to get into now, but thanks for the question. Would you join the BRICS nations? Thank you for that question, Wes. We don't need to join the BRICS nations. We don't need to join the BRICS. We don't need to. There's a different way to do things, but I can't get into that in full details right now. Also, for the strategic reasons, it's not wise to really speak to that in detail. So, no, we're not looking to join the BRICS per se. In fact, we have some solutions that are that is going to cause the BRICS nations and the existing system to take a double take on the matter of monetary solutions. We have some really, really good ideas that cannot yet be shared at this stage of the game. But thanks for asking. All right, we have 2 minutes to go. Let's see if we can take another question or comment. Please make sure you have everything in place so they don't steal the election. We shall definitely try, Christopher Lawrence. We shall try to have everything in place. I can't stress enough that without money, we can't win the election. I can't stress it enough. It's just very practical that we need to understand that. Any other questions or comments? Any other questions or comments? Let's see here if we have any more. Did I miss any? Let's see here. Okay, thanks for answering the question. To the head of both parties as treasurer of the Jamaica. Okay, I follow. Thank you, Ms. Graham. Appreciate that. Let's see what we have here. Road and infrastructure across the island. What would that look like? Beautiful. Sir Mackenzie, it's going to look like Singapore. Can you imagine little Singapore has such a high-speed rail system? So we're going to have that, a high-speed rail system from east to west with T-bone structures across to get you into all 14 parishes. Our goal is to make sure you can live in any one of the parishes and get to another parish to work in under 45 minutes on the rail system. We're also going to put in a new bus and taxi service that is driven similar to the Uber system, where you literally can, follow on your phone and know exactly when you can pick up your bus or get to your taxi or get to the train, for it to take you to wherever. So a very, very different Jamaica, very efficient Jamaica. We're going to focus on efficiency and focus on a modern system of transportation across the country to make it very, very easy to get to work, to move goods and services around the country at very affordable cost, very accessible, very clean, very quiet, very peaceful. So not the kind of noisy, raucous situation you have right now and dirty and haggard, and no more of that. We're talking about a very different Jamaica. A Jamaica where we have pride and we're classic, we're classy, we're quite modern in our behavior and outlook. Okay, what else do we have here? Okay, so Sean Campbell, yes, the UIC is against the death penalty only because it's not reversible. You can't reverse the death penalty. I know in some cases you may have all the facts. It is so clear cut that the person has committed a murder. But the reason why everybody wants the death penalty is because we have failed to manage crime, right? Once you start to manage crime and get the whole thing under control, then people won't be so pushy about the death penalty. We will punish criminals severely, but most importantly, we're going to look at rehabilitation, and we want to make sure that we get the criminal to pay for the crime, as best as possible. But we're not quick to pursue the death penalty because the state can be wrong, and often, we have systems that fail. So we want to make sure that that is truly a very, very last resort in the process. But there's lots more we can do. We can capture a lot of the problem from the early years and help our young people not to become criminals. And I want to focus on that. So this person says, people start to know about the UIC now. Let's get the message to all Jamaicans. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you all very much. Have a good night. And remember, one UIC, one Jamaica, stronger together. We can do this. We must do this. We will do this. Let's all unite and rescue our country this election cycle. We must not allow what is happening now to continue beyond the next election. It must stop now. Thank you very much. Have a good night and see you again soon. Take care.